I still remember the first time I truly felt the weight of North Carolina's wilderness pressing in on my every thought. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of how 4 friends and I made the mistake of venturing into the depths of Pisgah National Forest near Linville Falls. I share it not as a confession or even a cautionary tale, but more like an echo of experiences I can never scrub from my memory. Perhaps in telling it, I can finally let some of the darkness seep out of my mind and onto these pages, leaving me just light enough to move on with life. But I doubt it. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back among those towering pines, listening to them whisper secrets of an ancient sorrow. I should begin by telling you about us, about Mia, Caleb, Jenna, and me. We'd been friends for a few years, meeting through a combination of college classes and shared outdoorsy hobbies. Mia was the boldest of us, all relentless energy and an unshakable desire to stand on the edge of every cliff, peer into every cave, and ignore anyone who urged caution. Caleb was the pragmatist. While Mia dreamed up adventures and spouted daring plans, he was the one to cross-reference the route, check the weather, and make sure the gear was squared away. Then there was Jenna, who was a puzzle of empathy and premonitions. She felt deeply, joy, sadness, even the undercurrents of something unspoken, which she claimed she could sense in places. As for me, I like to think of myself as somewhere in the middle, constantly curious but somewhat measured in my approach. I carried a passion for local legends and histories, and I relished any chance to learn about a place's folklore. We decided on Pisgah National Forest for a long weekend of camping because the area near Linville Falls had been on Mia's bucket list for years. She'd seen pictures, read raving reviews about the scenic hiking trails, and found everything about the mountains enthralling. Caleb agreed. Pisgah's abundant trails and waterfalls promised us an unforgettable getaway. Jenna was interested too, though she quietly mentioned reading some strange tales about the region's haunted corners. As for me, I had read about the forest's history, how the Cherokees once lived and hunted in those woods, how the terrain was rumored to be haunted by restless spirits, how some campers spoke of encountering strange lights dancing between the pines. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed wholeheartedly. We set out on a crisp autumn morning. The Blue Ridge Parkway was a tapestry of burnt orange leaves and sunlight draping over rolling peaks. Even if I had known the horrors that awaited, I might have still come along just for that drive. There's something about the Blue Ridge Mountains that calms the soul, a sense of serenity unlike anywhere else. Patches of fog clung to the hillsides. The higher we climbed, the thinner the veil of mist became. We made a brief stop in Asheville for supplies. Some last-minute items like extra batteries, propane, energy bars. Locals in the store overheard our talk about Pisgah. One older gentleman eyed us warily. He was missing several front teeth and wore an expression that seemed torn between amusement and concern. But he said nothing, just watched us with a slow shake of his head. I caught that look. It should have been a warning, but I set it aside, chalking it up to the typical wariness people sometimes have when tourists boast about braving the deep woods. By midday, we reached the rugged back roads leading toward Linville Falls. Towering pines and hardwoods crowded along the roadside, making it look like we were entering a tunnel of living timber. Mia squealed with delight when she spotted a sign for a scenic overlook. She pulled over, ignoring Caleb's muttered complaint that we still had hours of daylight to make camp. We all scrambled out to take pictures, the canyon below us awash in golden sunlight. The distant roar of Linville Falls was mesmerizing, echoing against rocky cliffs. Far below, the water churned with a kind of primal energy. There was an unspoken solemnity about that view, like the land was both welcoming and cautioning us to tread lightly. Late that afternoon, we arrived at the campsite, an area that wasn't overly developed. We had chosen a more rustic spot, wanting privacy and authenticity. A narrow dirt trail branched off the main parking lot, leading to a clearing where we could pitch our tents beneath a canopy of maple and hickory trees. We set up camp. 2 tents, one for Mia and Jenna, one for Caleb and me. We organized our cooking gear, built a fire ring, and checked for water sources. Mia wanted to explore the surrounding trails immediately, but Caleb suggested we wait until morning after a good night's rest. Jenna stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing into the trees. When I asked her what was on her mind, she just shook her head and smiled, though her eyes were distant. That night, we roasted marshmallows, exchanged jokes, and stargazed. It was a perfect autumn evening, the sky a canvas of twinkling lights. None of us had the faintest idea that it would be our last serene moment for a very long time. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. I couldn't sleep and decided to step out of the tent. The fire was down to its last embers, and the moon was mostly hidden behind clouds. As I stood there, stretching my arms and breathing in the crisp air, I heard what sounded like distant laughter. It wasn't the cheery kind. There was a ragged edge to it, like someone hacking between wheezing chuckles. The forest floor around me was still. The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. I held my breath, scanning the trees. My flashlight traced slender trunks. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just an owl or the creak of branches. Still, I hurried back into the tent, my heart pounding. I didn't wake the others. I lay awake for hours, half listening for more sounds. Morning arrived with amber sunlight sliding through the tree canopy. The normalcy was comforting. Birds chirping, leaves rustling. Mia and Caleb started planning the day's hike. Jenna leaned against a tree, quietly sipping her coffee, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. I decided to brush off my late-night fright and went about preparing a quick breakfast. Then, as we were cleaning up, Jenna spotted something by the edge of the camp. Footprints, larger than any normal person's, pressed deep into the soft mud. But they weren't just large, they were irregular, oddly shaped, like someone or something had multiple toes that didn't align like a human foot. Caleb inspected them, scratching his head. He concluded they might be bear tracks, but to me, they looked more human than ursine. Mia shrugged it off, saying we should just keep an eye out. Jenna frowned, her concern deepening when she noticed the footprints seemed to form a circle around our campsite. I forced a laugh, remarking it was probably just some trick of perspective, but no one smiled. We set off on a trail that led us closer to Linville Falls. The forest was breathtaking, with dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. At first, everything felt normal. Mia forging ahead, Caleb pointing out interesting flora, Jenna touching tree bark as though trying to sense something beyond the physical. I lingered at the back, absorbing the sights, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me. After about an hour, we reached a vantage point overlooking the waterfall. Linville Falls thundered into the gorge below, sending up a spray that glittered in the sunlight. The roar was captivating, and for a while we forgot about the footprints. We took photos, shouted over the noise, and felt the raw power of nature surge through us. On the hike back, we decided to detour onto a less traveled path. Mia's curiosity beckoned her to see if there was another hidden overlook, or a smaller waterfall we could discover. I was hesitant. Something about leaving the main trail unsettled me, but Mia's passion was infectious. We followed her through thick vegetation. The path was almost non-existent at points, but we pressed on. About 20 minutes into our detour, the environment changed. The chirping birds quieted, and a thin mist wove between the tree trunks. The temperature dropped noticeably, enough for goosebumps to rise on our arms. Jenna stopped abruptly, claiming she saw someone flit behind a tree ahead. We all paused, scanning the vegetation. No one was there. Caleb grunted, irritated, but even he couldn't deny the strangeness of the sudden chill and silence. We tried to retrace our steps to the main trail, but somehow the path we had come from seemed to vanish. It's not unusual to get turned around in unfamiliar woods, but this was different. We felt like the forest was rearranging itself around us. Each direction we chose led us deeper into a silent gloom. More curious still, the ground showed signs of disturbance. Twigs snapped, leaves scattered, almost as if something had been dragging itself through the area. Jenna clutched Mia's arm, trembling. Mia whispered for us to keep moving, that we'd find our way if we just remained calm. Caleb consulted our map and compass, but the readings seemed off, the arrow wobbling unnaturally. I told myself there must be a magnetic deposit in the ground, or we were just incompetent with orientation. Still, it was unnerving. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small clearing with a few stone markers protruding from the ground. At first glance, I thought it might be a forgotten cemetery plot, but as we approached, we saw that these weren't ordinary gravestones. They were flat stone slabs etched with bizarre symbols, spirals, shapes resembling animals but twisted. Moss and lichen had all but smothered any inscriptions, but the arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. There was an uncanny hush there. We sensed we were intruding on something old, perhaps older than any of us could imagine. That was when we heard the first guttural cry. It sounded part animal, part human, echoing from behind the trees. My blood ran cold. Mia's eyes narrowed, fear creeping into her fearless facade. Caleb scanned the area, clenching his jaw. Jenna looked like she was about to cry. Another cry, closer, more insistent, reverberated through the clearing. It was as though something was warning us to leave. We didn't argue with that. We bolted in the direction we assumed would lead us back to our original trail. Bushes tore at our clothes, and branches scratched our arms and faces. The forest parted mercifully, and we spilled back onto a recognizable path. We found ourselves panting, hearts pounding, as we finally recognized the signs that pointed back to the main trail. None of us had the stomach to explore further that day. We retreated to our campsite, shaken and exhausted. That evening, I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe there was a wounded animal making those cries. Perhaps the footprints in the stone clearing were just relics of an older time, with a perfectly logical explanation. Yet none of it felt natural. There was a tension in the air around our camp, as though the forest itself was frowning at our presence. Night descended quickly, the darkness thicker than before, and not just because we were on edge. It was a new moon, leaving the sky black except for the faint starlight. Our campfire seemed feeble. A wind rustled the branches overhead, and we began to hear sounds again. This time, it wasn't just laughter or distant howls. It sounded like children playing, thin, high-pitched giggles and the slap of small feet on the ground. We flashed our lights around, seeing nothing but swirling shadows. The laughter would stop whenever we aimed the beams, only to start up again behind us. At one point, Caleb jumped up, swearing he saw a little girl standing near a tree. He sprinted over, only to find empty space. It made no sense. We questioned whether we were all experiencing some mass hysteria, or maybe there was a group of actual children nearby. That idea made no sense, though. Who would let kids wander at midnight in the remote forest? Mia, unnerved, tried to shout into the trees, asking who was out there, but no answer came. The disembodied giggles continued, weaving in and out of the darkness, twisting our nerves into knots. When the laughter subsided, the forest grew deathly still. Then we heard something else, a low whispering that seemed to rise from the ground itself, as if the earth under our feet was trying to speak. We couldn't make out words, but it sent a chill through our bodies. Jenna began to sob softly, saying she could feel a sorrow radiating through the soil, something ancient and tormented. Mia, still trying to be the fearless one, tried to comfort her, but there was a tremor in her voice. Caleb shook his head and said we might be better off leaving before daylight, but I insisted we wait until first light. Hiking out in the dark, especially with whatever was out there, felt like a bad idea. None of us slept well that night. I drifted in and out of feverish dreams, hearing that raspy laughter echo in my mind. The dawn was cold and gray. No birdsong greeted us this time. The entire forest felt muted, as though something had smothered every living sound. We quickly decided to pack up camp and get out. The plan was simple: return to the parking lot, load up the car, and drive straight back to Asheville. But as we started dismantling our tents, we realized our gear had been tampered with. The sides of our tents had long scratch marks, each mark about half a foot in length, like claws had raked across the fabric. Our food supply had been rummaged through, scattered around the perimeter. That alone was unsettling, but what truly disturbed us was an odd symbol drawn in the dirt right in front of the tent I'd slept in. It was a spiral shape, with lines radiating from it, reminiscent of the carvings we'd seen on those stone markers. It wasn't there when we'd gone to sleep. We abandoned thorough packing, shoving items haphazardly into our bags, anxious to leave. We headed back onto the trail that led to the parking area. The entire time, I had the sense that something was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Occasionally, I'd see a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, some elongated shape that didn't quite resemble a human figure. Mia, uncharacteristically silent, walked with her fists clenched. Caleb led the way, trying to follow the same route we took in. Jenna was in the middle, every so often gasping softly, her eyes darting to the trees as though catching glimpses of something the rest of us missed. It took longer than expected to reach the parking area. The forest seemed denser, the path more confusing. When we did emerge at the dirt lot, we found our car and 2 other vehicles. That gave me a moment of relief. Other campers or hikers must be in the area. We quickly tossed our gear into the trunk. Caleb fumbled for the keys in his jacket pocket, turning them over with trembling fingers. As he pressed the key into the ignition, a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the trees behind us. It sounded close, like it was practically at the edge of the lot. The shriek had this multi-tonal quality, part human, part beast, and it made my stomach lurch. I yelled at Caleb to drive, and he slammed the car into reverse. We sped down the gravel road, kicking up a trail of dust behind us. As we drove, the shriek continued, accompanied by the rustling of branches as if something large was moving through the forest parallel to the road. Eventually the screams faded, or maybe we just outdistanced whatever was chasing us. None of us spoke for several minutes. the shock of what had happened numbing our minds. When we finally hit the main highway, I exhaled, tension streaming off my shoulders. Mia and Caleb appeared equally relieved. Jenna, however, was still rigid, her eyes filled with a dread I couldn't quite comprehend. She kept looking out the rear window, whispering that it wasn't over. We reached Asheville in the early afternoon, intending to find a motel for the night before making the drive back home the next day. Something, though, gnawed at me. I'd spent so long fascinated by local legends and folklore, yet I'd never once truly believed I'd come face to face with something I couldn't explain away. Jenna insisted she needed to talk to someone who might know more. She had a feeling that if we left the region without doing so, whatever we'd disturbed might follow. Mia scoffed at the idea, but Caleb, still reeling from the morning's chaos, suggested we at least entertain the notion. So we found ourselves in a dusty bookstore, recommended by an Asheville local who specialized in the occult. The proprietor was a middle-aged woman named Marjorie, who looked at us with mild amusement when we described our experiences. She listened without interrupting, then nodded knowingly. Marjorie took out a worn map of the Pisgah area. She traced her fingers over several spots, including Linville Gorge, Brown Mountain, famous for its mysterious lights, and some lesser-known coves. She spoke of the land's deep ties to Native American legends, the sorrow of forced displacement, the blood spilled in conflicts, and the subsequent curses laid upon the place. She mentioned that entities, whether Wendigos, skinwalkers, or restless spirits, often manifest as a physical embodiment of the land's collective anguish. When we told her about the footprints, the laughter, and the shrieks, her expression grew serious. She told us something might have marked us, that we'd walked into an area rarely traversed by outsiders, perhaps stumbling onto a site of old ceremonies or a dwelling place for dark spirits. If it had indeed marked us, leaving might not guarantee safety. We left the bookstore with a swirl of conflicting emotions. Mia refused to believe we were somehow tethered to an ancient curse. Caleb seemed torn, but I could see the logic part of him wanting to reject it. Jenna, however, was convinced, and that night she insisted we perform a small ritual she'd read about, a gesture of respect to appease restless spirits. We gathered in the parking lot of our motel, feeling foolish but desperate. We lit a small bundle of sage, as Marjorie had suggested, and recited a short invocation of peace, asking forgiveness for trespassing on sacred ground. The night air was still. We concluded the attempt, extinguished the sage, and retreated to our rooms. At around 3 a.m, I shot up in bed, drenched in sweat. A howling wind battered the motel's thin walls, rattling the windows. A shadow flitted past the curtains, a silhouette that loomed and then vanished. I ran to the window, threw open the curtain, and saw nothing in the parking lot except our car. Yet my heart wouldn't stop hammering. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Mia knocked frantically on my door. She too had been awakened by the wind and the sense of something unearthly lurking outside. We quickly checked on Jenna and Caleb, who were in the room across from mine. Jenna was sitting up in bed, eyes red from crying, clutching her arms like she was freezing. Caleb looked bewildered, pacing near the door. That was the point we realized running hadn't solved anything. It was as though something had followed us out of the forest, or maybe we had carried it with us in our minds. Regardless, it became clear we needed closure. Jenna refused to leave North Carolina without returning to the forest. Her reason was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She believed we had to properly acknowledge the presence and leave an offering or apology that was more than just a makeshift ritual in a motel parking lot. Mia reacted with alarm, calling the idea suicidal. Caleb wavered, but I could see the silent nod in his posture. He sensed, as I did, that we were in some twisted pact with forces beyond our comprehension. The mere thought of going back to that place made my stomach churn, but doing nothing felt worse. In the morning, we drove out of Asheville, not back toward home, but in the direction of the Blue Ridge Parkway once again. The day was bright, deceptively so, and I couldn't help but think the forest would appear just as tranquil as it did before our nightmares began. This time, though, we were planning to head to a different section of Pisgah, one closer to some older roads that locals rarely used, where we could search for a rumored lost cove or a remote clearing with more evidence of those stone markers. We parked near an overlook, stepping out into a crisp breeze that carried the scent of pine. Far below, in the valleys, a layer of fog lingered like a spectral ocean. We each shouldered our packs, loaded with provisions, flashlights, a first aid kit, and a few trinkets we hoped could serve as peace offerings, crystals, a small dream catcher, a ring of polished stones. The hike started innocently, the gentle slopes of the trail luring us forward. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and the occasional chipmunk scurried across our path. Yet an underlying tension crackled in the air. None of us spoke much. After half an hour, we veered off the established path onto a faint corridor in the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became, just like before. It was eerie how quickly the birds vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence. Our footsteps felt intrusive, as though we were walking in a sacred chamber not meant for our presence. Eventually, the land descended into a small hollow. There, we found another series of stone markers, some leaning against trees, others partially buried under layers of fallen leaves. They looked even more weathered than the ones we'd encountered earlier. A tingling sensation crawled up my spine. Something about that spot felt heavy with memory, like we had stepped into a place saturated with a tragic history. Jenna took out a small pouch of crystals, kneeling to place them gently by the largest stone. Mia stood guard, scanning the trees, obviously spooked. Caleb and I shared a glance, uncertain what to do next. Jenna closed her eyes and murmured a soft apology. She spoke of respect for those who had come before and asked for safe passage. The words sounded heartbreakingly small in that vast ancient place. We might have stayed kneeling like that for minutes or hours. Time seemed distorted. At some point, the temperature dropped sharply again. A chill wind swept through the hollow, rattling branches and flinging leaves in a sudden swirl. It felt like the forest exhaled a deep, mournful breath. The distant giggle of a child rang through the trees, freezing our blood. Then, emerging from the gloom, came a figure, tall, gaunt, with skin stretched taut over unnatural angles. It was as though each limb bent in multiple directions. Its eyes glowed with a dull fire, and when it opened its mouth, the face contorted. A sound, part snarl, part moan, rippled through the air. Mia stumbled back, swallowing a scream. Caleb braced himself as though he might fight it. My mind went blank with terror. Jenna, tears streaming down her cheeks, stood and faced it. The figure's presence was suffocating, reeking of decay and heartbreak. It seemed to flicker in place, as if it struggled to remain fully materialized. Then it jerked its head sharply to the side, looking past us, toward the stones. A low, rattling growl escaped its throat, and it shuffled closer. Jenna held out her hands, trembling, and whispered that we came to make peace. The creature's eyes flicked to her, and I swear I saw them soften for the briefest moment. Then it let out a horrible shriek that tore at my eardrums. Jenna collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Caleb, perhaps acting on instinct, grabbed a handful of the polished stones from Jenna's pouch and flung them at the creature's feet. Sparks of light danced as they struck the ground, but the creature recoiled, hissing. It backed away, its limbs contorting in unnatural arcs. Mia pulled Jenna away from the stones, and I stood, placing myself between them and the creature. In a quavering voice, I told it we were sorry for trespassing, that we understood we'd disturbed a sacred place, and we would leave if that was its will. I didn't know if it could understand me, but for a moment, it seemed to hesitate. The forest around us felt like it was holding its breath. Suddenly, the creature lurched forward, covering the distance in a heartbeat. It towered over me, rancid breath filling my nostrils. I couldn't move, rooted by pure dread. It stared into my eyes, and in those eyes, I saw a tapestry of anguish and rage, centuries of betrayal, the sorrow of a land plundered, old ceremonies twisted by hatred. It was as though the forest itself had birthed this abomination, an avatar of pain. Then it stepped back, letting out a sound like a death rattle. It reached for one of the stones on the ground, holding it in a twisted hand. For a moment, its fingers clasped around the stone with surprising gentleness, as if something in that small token resonated. Then its face twisted into a sneer, and it flung the stone against a tree, shattering it into fragments. Mia let out a cry, pulling Jenna to her feet. Caleb and I exchanged a quick look, realizing there was no negotiation to be had. This spirit or entity was beyond appeasement. If anything, our intrusion had only brought its fury to the surface. The air crackled as it emitted another roar, a swirling current of energy lifting leaves and debris into a chaotic dance. We ran. There was no planning to it. We scrambled up the slope we had descended, away from the hollow, away from that place of unending sorrow and rage. Somewhere behind us, the creature followed, though we never got a clear look at it during our flight. We sensed its presence, crashing through the undergrowth, rattling branches. When we made it back to a more defined trail, we kept running, lungs burning, hearts threatening to explode. The forest became a blur. Then, in our blind rush, we burst into another clearing. There we saw something else that made my stomach twist. Small shapes moving at the periphery of our vision, shapes that looked like children. Their laughter was faint but audible, the same giggles we'd heard before. They flickered in and out of view, ephemeral as mist. Were they ghosts, illusions, or something else entirely? Their faces were obscured by shadow. One moment I thought I saw tear streaks on a pale cheek. The next, they were gone, only to reappear behind another tree. Their presence seemed tethered to the same sorrowful energy as the creature. The children's laughter was tinged with longing, as if they were caught in some eternal game of hide and seek. They reached out toward us with small hands, beckoning. Mia swore under her breath, scanning frantically for a way around them. I could see in her expression she was close to panic, stuck between pity for what might be lost souls and a primal urge to flee. Caleb grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. Jenna whispered that these children were remnants of a tragedy, maybe from decades or centuries past. A wave of compassion momentarily broke through my terror. Then we heard the creatures shriek again, closer than ever, snapping us back to the urgency of our predicament. We skirted the clearing, ignoring the faint voices that seemed to call our names. The forest beyond was a twisted maze, yet somehow we found a semblance of a path. Our flight continued, adrenaline fueling us long after our muscles begged for rest. Only when we noticed bright rays of sunlight piercing through the canopy did we realize we were nearing an actual trailhead. The trees parted, revealing a small gravel lot where a single rusted truck was parked. A man wearing a worn flannel shirt stood by it, staring at us as we burst from the woods. We must have looked wild, dirty, scratched, terror-stricken. The man, who introduced himself shakily as Lester, asked if we were all right. Mia burst into a tearful laugh, her nerves unraveling. Caleb clutched his side, barely able to speak. Lester offered us a ride, but we refused, preferring to reach our own car. We convinced him to lead us to the nearest highway. On the drive, we remained silent. Lester didn't press for answers, though his sideways glances suggested he had some inkling of what lurks in these woods. At the highway, we thanked him and parted ways. We eventually reached our car, which we had left miles back near the overlook. None of us dared look back at the tree line. We drove in a stunned silence. When we arrived in Asheville, we refueled, gathered our things from the motel, and continued on the road out of North Carolina. Part of me kept expecting the creature to appear in the rearview mirror, or for that laughter to echo in the back seat. We spoke little during the ride home, too drained and rattled for conversation. Every now and then Jenna would give a soft cry in her sleep, or Mia would curse under her breath at nothing in particular. Caleb drove with a stoic expression, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and I just stared out the window at the receding mountains, wondering if we'd truly left that horror behind. In the weeks that followed, we tried to slip back into normalcy, but normalcy never fully returned. Mia threw herself into work, as if burying her trauma under projects and deadlines. Caleb took to reading extensively about the region's history and legends, trying to find a rational explanation, or at least a storyline that fit our experiences. Jenna struggled most visibly, plagued by nightmares. She claimed to hear the forest calling her name at odd hours. She tried therapy, meditation, anything to quell the sense of foreboding that lingered in her mind. As for me, I tried writing it all down, documenting every moment of the trip in obsessive detail. That's how I discovered that simply recounting events was not enough. The memory of that creature, its twisted limbs and glowing eyes, kept me awake at night. Sometimes I would dream I was back in that hollow with the stone markers, a silent witness to ancient rituals I couldn't comprehend. Rumors reached us of other hikers who claimed to have seen strange lights or heard children laughing when no children were present. Some spoke of a hideous figure glimpsed at the edge of the forest. These accounts would surface on obscure internet forums or in whispered stories among outdoor enthusiasts. Each time I came across one, I felt a surge of fear and relief, realizing we were not alone in our experiences. Yet it offered little comfort. The land remains, ancient and brooding, and the entity we encountered endures as part of that land's sorrow. Sometimes I wonder if it's possible to truly sever the connection we forged. The ritual Jenna performed might have shown the slightest respect, but the violent reaction of the creature implies that the wounds in that place run deeper than any apology can heal, and perhaps healing isn't what it seeks. There's a grim possibility that it exists to perpetuate the suffering that birthed it. The children's ghosts, if they are truly ghosts, might be trapped in a cycle of echoing heartbreak, I've read enough folklore to know that not every spirit yearns for release. Some are bound in anger or pain, indifferent to closure. Months later, our small group has drifted apart in subtle ways. The weight of our shared nightmare presses on each of us differently. Mia still tries to plan adventures, but they're safer now, more controlled. State parks with well-lit campsites and plenty of other campers around. Caleb's skepticism has eroded into something like cautious respect for the unknown. Jenna remains haunted, uncertain if she has left a part of herself in those woods. As for me, I can't escape the sense that a door has been opened in my mind. Where once I saw local legends and ghost stories as entertaining oddities, I now recognize them as cracks in the veneer of our world, openings into deeper, darker truths that brush against our reality when we're most vulnerable. I have not set foot in Pisgah National Forest since, and I doubt I ever will. But sometimes I catch myself staring at a map of North Carolina's mountainous regions, my curiosity tinged with dread. I recall the hush of those trees, the heartbreak woven into that land, and the moment I locked eyes with a being that shouldn't exist. In that instant, it felt as though centuries of torment and a thirst for vengeance poured from its gaze into my own. It was a burden too great for a mortal to bear, yet it demanded that I understand, or at least acknowledge, the depth of its rage. People ask me why I don't just put all this behind me, bury it and move on. I wish I could, but the memory is as much a part of me now as any of my happiest moments. The forest took something from me, some precious layer of certainty or optimism. In return, it left me with a fraught respect for all that might dwell in the shadows of our world. And so I go on, as do Mia, Caleb, and Jenna, each of us carrying the mark of that encounter in ways visible only to those who've seen what lurks behind the veneer of everyday life. Perhaps one day I'll wake up free from nightmares, free from the echoes of laughter that sometimes drift through my half-awake mind. Maybe I'll believe that the creature forgot about us and has returned to its dark hollow, prowling those ancient markers and howling its grief into the lonely night. But deep down, I suspect these things never truly depart. They merely wait, watching, bearing witness to the slow passing of human years, and maybe they feed on the fear left behind. I try not to dwell on this. I try to find comfort in everyday routines, in the bright morning sun, in the laughter of normal life. Yet part of me knows that when darkness falls and the wind rustles the pines, some remnant of that ancient sorrow stirs in the distance, reminding me how thin the veil between worlds can be. If you ever drive down the Blue Ridge Parkway and feel a sudden chill seize your bones, or hear a hushed laugh echo through the treetops, remind yourself to keep moving. Sometimes curiosity cuts deeper than any blade. You may believe you are alone, but the forest is alive, filled with echoes of the past and apparitions born of pain. And if, by some ill fate, you decide to wander off the known trails, you might find yourself in a lonely clearing where ancient stones bear silent witness. Or perhaps you'll hear the giggling of phantom children on the wind, or glimpse the silhouette of an impossibly tall figure with blazing eyes. When that happens, recall my warning, because once you've beheld the true horror hidden among the pines, it may never let you go.